Watch the Muslim pilot in uniform lighting books in the maintenance area. His name is Akil. He just gathered every Bible from the crew rest area. Then something impossible happens. He suddenly collapses, sobbing uncontrollably on his knees.
My name is Akil. I'm 42 years old, and on December 27, 2019, I committed what I thought was a righteous act at Heathrow Airport. I was a 15-year veteran Emirates pilot, devout Muslim, and I had just finished burning Christian Bibles. Then Jesus changed everything. I need to take you back to understand who I was before that December morning changed everything. I was born in Dubai to parents who lived and breathed Islam. My father was an imam at our local mosque, and my mother taught Quran classes to young girls. From the moment I could speak, I was reciting verses in Arabic, performing ablutions 5 times a day, and learning that Islam was not just my religion but my entire identity. Growing up, our house was a fortress of faith. Every wall had Arabic calligraphy proclaiming the greatness of Allah. We walked to the call to prayer before sunrise, and we ended each day reading from the Quran together as a family. My father would tell me stories of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and how we were chosen people, guardians of the true faith. I believed every word with the passion only a child can possess. When I told my parents I wanted to become a pilot, my father initially resisted. He worried about the corrupting influences of Western culture, the temptations of traveling to non-Muslim countries, but I convinced him that flying could be my jihad, my holy struggle. I would carry Muslim passengers to Mecca for Hajj. I would connect the Islamic world. I would be an ambassador of our faith in the skies. The years of training were grueling, but I held on to that vision. Every hour of flight school, every examination, every certification was done in service to Allah. When Emirates Airlines finally hired me, I felt like I had been chosen for a divine mission. For 15 years, I flew those routes with pride. I prayed in airplane lavatories when prayer times came during flights. I fasted during Ramadan even at 35,000 feet. I was a Muslim pilot, and that meant everything to me. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever been so certain about something that it became the core of your identity? That was Islam for me. It was not something I believed, it was something I was. Every decision, every relationship, every moment of my life was filtered through my faith. I looked down on Christians as misguided people who had corrupted the pure message that Allah had given through Jesus, who was just a prophet, not the Son of God. During layovers in London, I would see churches and feel a mixture of pity and disgust. How could these people worship three gods when Allah had made it clear that He was one? How could they believe that God had a son when Allah is above such human limitations? I would walk past their cathedrals and mosques with equal reverence, but the mosques felt like home, while the churches felt like monuments to spiritual confusion. My crew members knew me as the religious one, while others would spend layovers exploring pubs or tourist attractions. I would find the nearest mosque for prayers. I carried a small prayer rug in my flight bag, always oriented myself toward Mecca, always maintained my ritual purity. Some of my colleagues, even other Muslims, would joke that I was too serious about religion, but I wore their comments like badges of honor. The crew quarters at various airports became my sanctuaries. These were spaces where Muslim flight crews could pray, where we could find halal food, where we could maintain our Islamic practices while traveling the world. I considered these rooms sacred spaces, little pieces of the Islamic world transplanted into foreign territories. That is why what I discovered on December 26, 2019, during our layover at Heathrow felt like such a violation. I had entered the crew rest area to perform my afternoon prayers when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There, neatly arranged on the small table where we usually placed our Quran copies, were 6 leather-bound books with golden crosses on their covers, Bibles. My hands started trembling as I picked up the first one. Inside the front cover, someone had written in neat English, "For our Muslim brothers and sisters with love and prayers, may you find the peace that passes understanding." John 3:16. The audacity of it made me physically ill. Someone had deliberately placed these books in our sacred space, trying to convert us, trying to corrupt the very place where we sought spiritual refuge. I started searching the entire rest area like a man possessed. Behind prayer mats, I found more Bibles. In the small kitchen area, tucked between halal meal packages, more Bibles. In the storage lossets, hidden among extra uniforms, even more Bibles. Whoever had done this had been systematic, strategic. They had invaded our space like spiritual colonizers. The anger that built inside me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This was not just disrespect. This was warfare. These Christians, these missionaries, had declared war on our faith by placing their corrupted scriptures in our holy space. I felt like the early Muslims must have felt when they were persecuted, when they had to defend the purity of Islam against those who wanted to destroy it. I gathered every single Bible I could find, 12 books in total. 12 attempts to lead my brothers and sisters astray from the straight path of Islam. As I held them in my arms, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Allah had placed me here to discover this violation. Allah had chosen me to respond. The plan formed in my mind with crystal clarity. I would not simply throw these books away where someone might retrieve them. I would not simply complain to airport authorities who might not understand the severity of this religious attack. I would send a message that would protect every Muslim who used this crew area. I would purify this space with fire. Looking back now, I can see how hatred had consumed my heart so completely that I believed destruction was righteousness. But in that moment, walking towards the maintenance area with those 12 Bibles clutched against my chest, I felt like a warrior for Allah, ready to defend my faith with the same passion that had driven me to become a pilot in the first place. I carried those 12 Bibles through the corridors of Heathrow like I was carrying weapons of mass destruction. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears, but it was not fear that drove my pulse. It was righteous indignation mixed with something that felt like divine purpose. Every step towards the maintenance area felt like I was walking in the footsteps of the Prophet himself, defending Islam against those who would corrupt it. The maintenance area was perfect for what I needed to do. It was a small enclosed room used for storing cleaning supplies and minor equipment repairs. Most importantly, it was rarely visited during early morning hours, and it had a large metal waste bin that could contain what I was about to do. As I entered the room and closed the door behind me, I felt like I was entering a battlefield where I would fight for the honor of Allah. I arranged the 12 Bibles on the concrete floor in front of the metal bin. Looking at them spread out like that, with their golden crosses gleaming under the fluorescent lights, I felt my anger intensify. These were not just books. These were symbols of everything wrong with Christianity, everything that had corrupted the pure message that Allah had originally given to Jesus. They represented centuries of theological lies, the blasphemous claim that God had a son, the ridiculous doctrine of the Trinity. As I reached into my pocket for my lighter, I began reciting verses from the Quran that I had memorized as a child. Say, He is Allah, the One, Allah, the Eternal, Absolute. He begets not, nor is He begotten, and there is none like unto Him. The words felt like armor protecting me as I prepared to purify this space from Christian corruption. I picked up the first Bible, the one with the handwritten note about John 3:16. The irony was not lost on me that Christians always quoted that verse about God loving the world so much that He gave His only Son. What blasphemy! Allah does not have sons or daughters. Allah is above such human limitations. As I flicked the lighter and held the flame to the corner of the book, I whispered, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful." The paper caught fire immediately, curling and blackening as the flames consumed the words. Watching those verses burn felt like watching lies being destroyed by truth. The smell of burning paper filled the small room, and I found it strangely satisfying. This was purification. This was justice. This was what needed to happen to protect my fellow Muslims from spiritual poison. One by one, I fed the remaining Bibles to the flames. With each book that burned, I felt more vindicated, more powerful, more certain that I was doing Allah's will. The second book burned faster than the first. The third book seemed to resist the flames for a moment before surrendering to the fire. By the fourth book, I had developed a rhythm, a ceremony that felt almost religious in its precision. As I burned the fifth and sixth books, I began thinking about the Muslim crew members who would use this rest area in the coming days and weeks. They would never know how close they had come to spiritual corruption. They would never realize that their brother Akil had saved them from the temptation to read these Christian lies. I felt like a guardian angel, invisible but essential. The seventh, eighth, and ninth books went into the flames with increasing satisfaction. I was no longer just burning books. I was burning centuries of Christian missionary activity. I was burning the Crusades and the colonization and every attempt by Western Christians to impose their false religion on Muslim lands. Every page that turned to ash was a victory for Islam. When I reached the 10th book, I paused to appreciate the magnitude of what I was doing. This was not destruction. This was liberation. I was freeing this space from spiritual contamination. I was ensuring that the next Muslim pilot who came here to pray would encounter only purity, only the peace that comes from being in a place where Allah alone is worshipped. The 11th book burned with what seemed like particular intensity. The flames leapt higher, the pages crackled more loudly, the smoke rose thicker. I took it as a sign that Allah approved of my actions. Even the fire seemed eager to consume these false scriptures, as if nature itself recognized the righteousness of what I was doing. As I prepared to burn the final Bible, the 12th one, I held it up toward the ceiling like an offering. "This is for you, Allah," I whispered. "This is to protect your faithful servants from those who would lead them astray." I felt a surge of spiritual power, a connection to something greater than myself. I was not just Akil the pilot anymore. I was Akil the defender of the faith. The last book caught fire with an almost explosive intensity. The flames seemed to dance higher than before, and the heat made me step back slightly. But I did not look away. I watched every page curl and blacken. I watched the golden cross on the cover disappear into ash. I watched until there was nothing left but smoke and the satisfying crackle of complete combustion. Standing there in that maintenance room, surrounded by the smoke of 12 burned Bibles, I felt a sense of completion that I had never experienced before. The anger that had driven me to this moment was still there, but now it was mixed with something else: pride, satisfaction, the deep peace that comes from knowing you have done exactly what you were supposed to do. I crossed my arms over my chest and allowed myself a moment of pure self righteousness. I had protected Islam. I had defended my faith. I had sent a clear message to any Christian missionaries who thought they could corrupt Muslim spaces with their false scriptures. The metal bin contained nothing but ash and smoke, but to me, it contained victory. In that moment, standing over the flames of those burned books, feeling more righteous and justified than I had ever felt in my life, I had absolutely no idea that I was about to encounter the very God I had just tried to reject. I had no idea that the Jesus whose book I had burned was about to reveal himself to me in a way that would shatter everything I thought I knew about faith, truth, and love. But he was coming, and nothing would ever be the same. I stood there over the smoldering ashes, breathing in the acrid smoke, feeling like a conquering warrior who had just won the most important battle of his life. The metal bin contained nothing but blackened remains and wisps of grey smoke curling upward. Every page of every Bible had been reduced to ash. Every word of what I considered Christian lies had been consumed by righteous fire. In that moment, I felt closer to Allah than I had ever felt in my 37 years of faithful Islamic practice. The maintenance room was completely enclosed with no windows and only one door. The ventilation system was minimal, designed only to prevent stuffiness, not to handle the kind of smoke I had just created. As I stood there savoring my victory, I became aware that the smoke was getting thicker, settling around me like a grey blanket. But I did not mind. If anything, it felt like incense in a sacred ceremony, the sweet smell of spiritual purification. That is when it started. The first thing I noticed was a sound that made no sense. It was like wind, but not wind. It was like the whooshing of air through a tunnel, but we were in a sealed room. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a gentle breeze that you might feel on a spring day. But within seconds, it began to intensify in ways that defied every law of physics I understood as a pilot. The wind was coming from everywhere and nowhere. It was swirling around the room in patterns that seemed impossible in such a confined space. I looked up at the ceiling, thinking perhaps a ventilation duct had burst open, but all the air vents were closed and undamaged. I looked around the walls for broken seals or open doors, but everything was exactly as it had been moments before. But the wind kept growing stronger. Within 30 seconds, what had started as a gentle breeze became a powerful gust that made me step backward to maintain my balance. The smoke from the burned Bibles, which had been rising in neat columns toward the ceiling, suddenly began swirling in wild patterns around the room. Pieces of ash that should have settled into the bottom of the metal bin were being lifted into the air and spun around like autumn leaves in a tornado. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe there was an air pressure problem in the building. Maybe a nearby aircraft engine was creating some kind of atmospheric disturbance. Maybe the airport's climate control system was malfunctioning. But even as I grasped for logical explanations, something deep in my gut knew that what I was experiencing was beyond the realm of natural phenomena. The wind continued to intensify until it reached hurricane force. I am not exaggerating when I say hurricane force. As a pilot, I have experienced turbulence that can throw grown men around aircraft cabins. I have flown through storms that can tear planes apart, but I had never experienced anything like the supernatural wind that was now raging inside that sealed maintenance room. The most impossible part was the burned Bible pages. Instead of being scattered randomly by the wind, the ashes and partially burned fragments were swirling imperfect, controlled circles around me. They moved with precision and purpose, forming patterns that looked almost choreographed. Pages that should have been destroyed were somehow reconstituting themselves, flying through the air in formation like a flock of paper birds. I reached out to grab one of the swirling fragments, thinking I could somehow stop this impossible phenomenon through force of will. But the moment my hand entered the swirling vortex of paper and ash, I felt something that made my entire body recoil in shock. It was not the paper I felt, it was presence, intelligence. Love is so powerful and overwhelming that it nearly knocked me off my feet. That is when I looked down at my hands and saw that they were shaking uncontrollably. Not a slight tremor you might get from too much caffeine or nervousness, but violent shaking that I could not stop no matter how hard I tried. My fingers were twitching, my palms were sweating, and my whole body began to feel like it was vibrating from the inside out. The sensation moved from my hands up my arms and into my chest. My heart began racing so fast that I thought I might be having a cardiac episode. My breathing became shallow and rapid. My knees started to feel weak, like they might buckle at any moment. But this was not fear in any way I had ever experienced it before. This was awe. This was the overwhelming presence of something so holy, so pure, so powerful that my human body simply could not process it. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever felt so small that you suddenly understood your true place in the universe? That is what happened to me in that moment. Standing in that swirling vortex of supernatural wind and flying Bible pages, I suddenly felt the full weight of my insignificance, not just as a human being, but as a creature standing in the presence of his creator. And that is when I knew, without hearing a voice, without seeing a figure, without any physical manifestation that I could point to or describe, I knew with absolute certainty that I was standing in the presence of God. Not Allah as I had understood him through Islam, but God as he truly was. And more shocking than anything else, I knew that this God was the God of the very books I had just burned. The presence was not angry with me, though I deserved anger. It was not condemning me, though I deserved condemnation. Instead, it was looking through me with love so complete, so unconditional, so perfect, that it shattered every defense I had ever built around my heart. I felt known, completely, totally, utterly known. Every thought I had ever thought, every intention I had ever harbored, every secret sin I had ever committed was visible to this presence, and yet the love never diminished. My knees buckled. I could not help it. The sheer weight of that love, combined with the crushing realization of my own sinfulness, drove me to the floor with a force that I could not resist. I fell forward onto my hands and knees, and immediately the tears started flowing. Not gentle tears of sadness or joy, but violent sobs that came from depths of my soul I did not even know existed. The wind continued to swirl around me. The pages continued their impossible dance, but now I was on the concrete floor, weeping like a child. The tears came so fast and so hard that I could barely breathe between sobs. All the anger that had driven me to burn those Bibles was replaced in an instant by overwhelming sorrow for what I had done. But more than sorrow, I felt love. Love from this presence that surrounded me, love that penetrated every cell of my body, love that whispered to my heart that despite everything I had done, despite the books I had burned, despite the hatred I had carried, I was forgiven. I was wanted. I was chosen. In that moment, collapsed on the floor of a maintenance room at Heathrow Airport, surrounded by supernatural wind and the impossible resurrection of pages I had tried to destroy, I knew that my life as a Muslim was over. Not because someone had convinced me with arguments or apologetics, but because I had encountered the living God, and He had a name I had never truly understood before: Jesus. The wind stopped as suddenly as it had begun. One moment I was surrounded by a supernatural hurricane that defied every law of physics, and the next moment the maintenance room was completely still. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears like thunder. I remained on my hands and knees on the cold concrete floor, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any motion might make me realize this had all been some kind of hallucination. But when I finally found the courage to lift my head and look around, the physical evidence of what had just happened was undeniable. The metal waste bin that had contained 12 burned Bibles was now filled not with ash but with perfectly intact pages that showed no signs of fire damage. The smoke that had filled the room moments before was completely gone, replaced by air so clean and pure it was almost sweet to breathe. The concrete floor around me was covered with Bible pages, but they were not scattered randomly as you would expect after a windstorm. They were arranged in neat patterns as if someone had carefully placed each one exactly where it needed to be. I picked up one of the pages with trembling hands. It was from the Gospel of John, chapter 3, and the verses were perfectly legible despite having been completely consumed by fire less than 10 minutes earlier. The paper was not even warm, there was no smell of smoke, no evidence of burning, no explanation for how something that had been reduced to ash could now be whole again before my eyes. My mind raced through every possible rational explanation. Maybe I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown brought on by stress. Maybe the fumes from the burning books had caused me to hallucinate. Maybe I was having a stroke or a seizure that was making me perceive things that were not really happening. But as I knelt there, surrounded by impossible evidence, touching pages that should not have existed, I knew with gut-wrenching certainty that what I had experienced was real. I tried to stand up, but my legs were shaking so badly that I immediately collapsed back onto my knees. The emotional impact of what had just happened was hitting me in waves. Terror mixed with awe, mixed with confusion, mixed with something I had never felt before in my life. It was love, but not the kind of love I had known. This was love that penetrated every defense, every wall, every barrier I had ever built around my heart. It was love that saw everything about me and chose to love me anyway. But alongside that overwhelming love came the crushing weight of realization about what I had just done. I had burned the holy books of the very God who had just revealed himself to me. I had destroyed the words of Jesus, who I was beginning to understand was not just a prophet as I had been taught, but something infinitely more. The magnitude of my sin was becoming clear to me in ways that my Islamic understanding of wrongdoing had never prepared me for. I began to weep again, but these tears were different from the ones that had come during the supernatural encounter. These were tears of shame, of regret, of the deepest sorrow I had ever experienced. I had spent my entire life believing I was serving God, but I had just committed an act of blasphemy against a true God that was so profound I could barely comprehend it. For the next hour, I remained in that maintenance room, afraid to leave, afraid to face the world outside. Every time I looked at the restored Bible pages surrounding me, I was reminded of the impossible thing that had just happened. Every time I tried to convince myself it was all in my imagination, the physical evidence proved otherwise. The pages were real. The restoration was real. The presence I had felt was real. I eventually gathered enough strength to collect all the Bible pages and carefully place them back in the waste bin. But as I did, I found myself reading verses that I had never truly paid attention to before. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. The very verse from John 3:16 that had been written in the front cover of the first Bible I burned was now staring back at me from a restored page. And for the first time in my life, I was reading it not as blasphemy, but as truth. When I finally left the maintenance room and returned to the crew quarters, I felt like I was walking in a completely different world. Everything looked the same, but I was fundamentally changed. My fellow crew members were preparing for our return flight to Dubai, going through their normal pre-flight routines, completely unaware that their colleague had just had an encounter with the living God. I tried to act normal, but I knew I was failing miserably. My captain noticed immediately that something was wrong. "Akil, you look pale," he said in Arabic. "Are you feeling sick? Do you need to see a medical officer?" I wanted to tell him that I was not sick in my body, but sick in my soul. I wanted to explain that I had just discovered everything we believed about God was incomplete. But how do you explain a supernatural encounter to someone who shares your Islamic worldview? For the entire flight back to Dubai, I sat in the cockpit going through the motions of being a pilot, while my mind raced through the implications of what had happened. Every time I looked out at the sky, I found myself wondering if the God who had just revealed himself to me was the same God who had created the heavens I was flying through. Every time I went through the routine radio communications, I found myself thinking about how I would eventually need to communicate with other people about what I had experienced. The most difficult part was the prayers. As a devout Muslim, I was required to pray 5 times a day, regardless of where I was or what I was doing. But as I knelt on my prayer rug in the aircraft lavatory facing toward Mecca, the words of the Islamic prayers felt foreign in my mouth for the first time in my life. How could I recite "There is no God but Allah" when I had just encountered Jesus in a way that suggested he was far more than the prophet I had been taught? Sleep was impossible for days after the incident. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those Bible pages swirling in impossible patterns around the maintenance room. Every time I began to drift off, I felt again the overwhelming presence of perfect love that had driven me to my knees. My wife noticed my restlessness but attributed it to job stress. My children noticed my distraction but assumed I was worried about flight schedules. But I knew I was wrestling with the most important question of my life. What do you do when everything you have believed about God is challenged by God Himself? Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself how you would respond if your deepest convictions were suddenly confronted by undeniable supernatural evidence. Would you have the courage to follow the truth wherever it led, even if it meant losing everything you had built your identity around? Because that is exactly the choice I was facing. And I had no idea that my real journey was just beginning. The sleepless nights turned into sleepless weeks. I would lie in bed next to my wife, staring at the ceiling of our Dubai apartment, replaying every moment of that supernatural encounter over and over in my mind. During the day, I functioned like a robot, going through the motions of being a husband, a father, a pilot, but inside I felt like I was drowning in questions that I could not ask anyone without destroying my entire life. The first thing I did was what any modern person does when they need answers. I turned to the internet, but I had to be incredibly careful. In the United Arab Emirates, openly researching Christianity could raise suspicions. Our internet activity was monitored, our social connections were scrutinized, and any indication that a Muslim was showing interest in other religions could result in serious consequences for career and family relationships. I waited until I was on layovers in European cities where I could use public computers in internet cafes. I would tell my crew members I was going shopping or sightseeing, but instead I would find quiet corners in London, Frankfurt, or Amsterdam where I could secretly search for information about Christianity. At first, I did not even know what questions to ask. I typed things like Jesus more than prophet and supernatural experiences with God and Muslim converts to Christianity. What I found terrified and fascinated me in equal measure. There were thousands of testimonies from Muslims who had experienced supernatural encounters with Jesus. Iranians, Pakistanis, Indonesians, Arabs, Turks, people from every corner of the Islamic world who described experiences remarkably similar to mine. Dreams, visions, miraculous healings, encounters with the divine presence that led them to conclude that Jesus was more than the prophet they had been taught he was. But reading these testimonies also forced me to confront the magnitude of what I was considering. These people had not just changed their religious opinions, they had been disowned by their families, fired from their jobs, exiled from their communities, and in some cases, threatened with death. The cost of following Jesus in the Islamic world was not just a personal, it was total social destruction. The breakthrough came during a layover in London 3 weeks after the incident. I had been walking past a small church near our hotel when I noticed the door was open and someone was inside cleaning. Something drew me toward that building in a way I cannot fully explain. It was not curiosity or intellectual interest. It was the same inexplicable pull I had felt during the supernatural encounter in the maintenance room. I stood outside that church for nearly an hour, wrestling with whether to enter. Everything in my Islamic training told me that entering a Christian church was haram, forbidden, a betrayal of my faith, but something deeper than my training was telling me that I needed to go inside, that there were answers waiting for me beyond that doorway. The man cleaning inside was the pastor, an elderly English gentleman named David, who seemed completely unsurprised when a nervous Arab man in an Emirates uniform walked tentatively through his church doors. He invited me to sit in one of the wooden pews and asked if I needed prayer or guidance. The kindness in his voice broke down some of the walls I had built around my secret. "I think I had an encounter with Jesus," I whispered, barely able to speak the words out loud. "But I am Muslim. I do not understand what it means." Pastor David sat down beside me and listened without judgment as I told him everything about the burning Bibles, the supernatural wind, the impossible restoration of the burned pages. I expected him to be shocked or skeptical, but instead he nodded with the calm confidence of someone who had heard similar stories before. "Akil," he said gently, "Jesus has a way of revealing himself to people in dramatic ways when they need to see him most clearly. What you experienced sounds like a divine intervention designed to get your attention. The question now is, what are you going to do with what you have learned?" That conversation was the first time anyone had explained the gospel to me in terms I could understand. Pastor David did not attack Islam or criticize my background. Instead, he simply explained what Christians believe about Jesus, that he was not just a prophet, but God incarnate, that he died on the cross to pay the penalty for human sin, and that salvation comes not through religious works, but through faith in what Jesus accomplished. In Islam, I told him, we earn our way to paradise through good deeds, through following the 5 pillars, through living righteously. Are you telling me that Jesus offers forgiveness as a free gift? That is exactly what I am telling you, Pastor David replied. The Bible says that salvation is by grace through faith, not by works, so that no one can boast. Jesus did the work. Our part is to believe and receive. For the first time since the supernatural encounter, I felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in my mind. The overwhelming love I had felt in that maintenance room was not Allah rewarding me for burning Christian books. It was Jesus loving me, despite my attempt to destroy His word. The restoration of those Bible pages was not a rebuke, but an invitation. God was not punishing me for my ignorance. He was calling me to truth, but understanding the gospel intellectually was very different from accepting it personally. Pastor David could see me struggling with the implications of what he was telling me. Akil, he said, this decision cannot be made with your mind alone. It requires your heart. Are you ready to surrender your life to Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? The moment he asked that question, I felt the same presence I had experienced during the supernatural encounter. Not as dramatically, not with wind and flying pages, but unmistakably the same divine love that had overwhelmed me 3 weeks earlier. It was as if Jesus himself was standing in that small London church, extending his hand toward me, waiting for my response. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where you knew that your next decision would determine the entire direction of your life? That is where I was sitting in that wooden pew. I could walk out of that church and return to my Islamic life, pretend the supernatural encounter never happened, and continue living the lie that had become my existence. Or I could surrender everything I had ever believed and follow the God who had loved me enough to burn and restore 12 Bibles just to get my attention. Through tears that I could not control, I whispered the words that would change everything. Jesus, I believe you are the Son of God. I believe you died for my sins and rose from the dead. I surrender my life to you. Please forgive me for everything I have done against you, and please save my soul. The moment I spoke those words, I felt a peace that I had never experienced in 37 years of Islamic practice. It was not dramatic like the supernatural encounter, but it was deep and complete and permanent. I knew with absolute certainty that I had just passed from death to life, from darkness to light, from the kingdom of this world to the kingdom of God. But I also knew that my real challenges were just beginning, because now I had to figure out how to live as a secret Christian in one of the most Islamic cities in the world. The flight back to Dubai after my conversion was the longest 8 hours of my life. I sat in the cockpit of that Emirates aircraft, going through all the routine procedures of international aviation, while inside I felt like a completely different person. Every time I looked out at the Arabian Peninsula spread below us, I wondered how I was going to survive as a Christian in a country where converting from Islam could cost me everything I had worked for. The first challenge came the moment I walked into my own home. My wife greeted me at the door as she always did, asking about my flight, telling me about our children's activities while I was away. But as she spoke, I found myself studying her face with new eyes, wondering how I would eventually tell the woman I loved that I had betrayed everything we both believed in. She had married a devout Muslim pilot, and now she was living with a secret Christian who could be imprisoned or worse if his new faith was discovered. Our children ran to embrace me, chattering about school and friends and the small dramas of their young lives. My daughter showed me a picture she had drawn of our family standing in front of the Kaaba in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam. My son recited Quranic verses he had memorized in his religious classes. Every innocent word they spoke felt like a knife in my heart because I knew that my conversion had the potential to destroy their lives along with mine. That first night, when it came time for evening prayers, I faced the most immediate practical challenge of my new life. My family expected me to lead our household prayers as I always had. But how could I face toward Mecca and recite Islamic prayers when I now believed Jesus was Lord? Yet how could I refuse without raising suspicions that would endanger all of us? I knelt on my prayer rug with my family, facing toward Mecca, and went through the motions of Islamic prayer while inwardly praying to Jesus for wisdom, protection, and forgiveness for the deception I was being forced to practice. It felt like living a double life, being a secret agent in my own family. The guilt was overwhelming, but I convinced myself it was temporary, that eventually I would find a way to safely share my new faith with those I loved most. The weeks that followed were a master class in spiritual schizophrenia. During the day, I functioned as Akil the Muslim pilot. I attended Friday prayers at the mosque near Emirates headquarters. I participated in Ramadan fasting with my colleagues. I made all the appropriate religious comments expected of a devout Muslim in UA society. But whenever I was alone, especially during international layovers, I was frantically trying to learn how to live as a Christian. I started carrying a small New Testament hidden in my flight bag, disguised inside the pages of aircraft maintenance manuals. During long flights, while my co-pilot handled routine procedures, I would secretly read the Gospels, trying to understand the Jesus who had supernaturally revealed himself to me in that London maintenance room. Every verse felt like a personal letter written specifically for my situation. The hardest part was the isolation. In Islam, faith is communal. We pray together, we fast together, we celebrate religious holidays together, but Christianity in Dubai had to be practiced in absolute secrecy. There were small underground churches for expatriate Christians, but attending them would have been impossible for someone in my position. Emirates pilots were expected to be role models of Islamic values, and any association with Christian activities would have been career suicide. I found spiritual community through encrypted internet connections with Pastor David back in London. He connected me with other Muslim background believers around the world who understood the unique challenges of secret faith. Through secure messaging apps, I learned about other pilots, engineers, doctors, and business professionals throughout the Middle East who were living double lives similar to mine. But the emotional toll was enormous. This constant fear of discovery, the guilt of deceiving my family, the loneliness of practicing my faith in complete isolation, all of it began to affect my mental and physical health. I lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and found myself making mistakes at work that could have been dangerous in aviation. The breakthrough came when I realized I had to start small steps toward living authentically. During one of my layovers in London, Pastor David arranged for me to be baptized in a private ceremony with just 3 witnesses. As I went under the water and came back up, I felt the same supernatural presence I had experienced during my conversion, confirming that I was walking in the right direction despite the difficulties. That baptism gave me courage to begin taking calculated risks to share my faith. I started with other Emirates crew members who I suspected might be open to spiritual conversations. During long international flights, when conversations naturally turn to deeper topics, I would carefully test whether colleagues were satisfied with Islam or if they had spiritual questions. To my amazement, I discovered that several other Muslim pilots and flight attendants were secretly wrestling with doubt about Islam. The rigid legalism, the emphasis on earning salvation through works, the treatment of women and minorities in Islamic societies, all of these issues were causing some of my colleagues to question whether the faith of their birth was really from God. Over the course of several months, I was able to share my testimony with 3 other Emirates crew members. One flight attendant, a woman from Pakistan who had been struggling with depression and finding no comfort in Islamic prayers, gave her life to Christ after I told her about the supernatural love I had experienced. A co-pilot from Egypt who had been secretly reading Christian materials he found in hotel rooms made his decision for Jesus during a layover conversation in Singapore. We formed a tiny secret cell group that met during international layovers in cities where we felt safe. We would gather in hotel rooms in London, Amsterdam, or Bangkok, reading the Bible together, praying for each other, and supporting one another through the challenges of living as heathen Christians in Islamic societies. The most difficult conversation came when I finally found the courage to approach my wife about my spiritual journey. I did not tell her directly about my conversion, but I began asking questions about whether she was truly satisfied with Islam, whether she ever wondered if there might be more to God than what we had been taught. Her responses revealed that she too had been having spiritual doubts, particularly about the Islamic teaching that her prayers were worth less than mine simply because she was a woman. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself this question: would you have the courage to risk everything you had built for the sake of spiritual truth? Because that is what my new life required every single day. Every conversation with family, every interaction with colleagues, every public appearance as an Emirates pilot was a choice between safety and authenticity, between the comfortable lie of my old life and the dangerous truth of my new identity in Christ. The transformation was not just spiritual but practical. Where I had once felt anger and superiority toward Christians, I now felt love and compassion for everyone, regardless of their religious background. Where I had once seen airline passengers as objects to transport, I now saw them as souls created by God who needed to experience His love. Where I had once flown planes simply as a job, I now saw every flight as an opportunity to pray for the cities we visited and the people we carried. My relationship with my family began to change in subtle but profound ways. I became more patient with my children, more loving toward my wife, more respectful toward my parents. They noticed these changes and attributed them to spiritual maturity in Islam, not realizing that the Jesus they considered a mere prophet was transforming their husband, father, and son from the inside out. 5 years have passed since that December morning when I burned 12 Bibles and encountered the living God. I am still an Emirates pilot, still living in Dubai, still navigating the complex challenges of being a Christian in an Islamic society. But I am no longer the angry, self-righteous man who thought burning books could protect his faith. I have been transformed by the love of Jesus Christ, and that transformation has affected every aspect of my life. Jesus changed everything for me, just like he can change everything for you. So I am asking you, just as a brother would, are you ready to surrender your life to the God who loves you enough to supernaturally intervene in your story, even when you are actively working against him?